In the summer of 1940, the skies above southern England were filled with the roar of engines and the sharp crack of machine guns. The Second World War had entered a terrifying new phase. German bombers crossed the English Channel almost daily, escorted by fast, deadly fighters. To stop them, young pilots of the Royal Air Force scrambled into the air in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, climbing quickly toward the incoming formations. Many of these pilots were barely in their 20s. Some had never fired their guns in combat before. Yet within minutes of takeoff, they were fighting for their lives high above the clouds. At first, the battles followed a familiar pattern. German bombers would approach the British coast, and RAF fighters would intercept them before they could reach their targets. Dogfights exploded across the sky, twisting and spiraling through the air at incredible speed. Pilots pushed their aircraft to the limit, pulling tight turns and diving attacks as they tried to outmaneuver their opponents. Every second mattered. A single mistake could mean death. But during these chaotic battles, something strange began happening to British pilots. Again and again, RAF fighters would line up for a diving attack on an enemy aircraft. The pilot would push the nose of the plane downward and accelerate into a steep dive, trying to close the distance quickly. The engine would roar as the aircraft picked up speed. The enemy fighter would grow larger in the gun sight. And then, without warning, the engine would suddenly choke. Instead of the steady roar of power, there was a violent splutter. The propeller slowed. The aircraft shuddered in the air. For a few terrifying seconds, the engine simply stopped responding. In combat, even a moment of lost power could be fatal. Some pilots thought they had made a mistake with the throttle. Others believed their aircraft had been damaged by enemy fire. But when they managed to escape and return to base, ground crews found no bullet holes and no mechanical damage. Everything appeared normal. At first, the incidents were dismissed as isolated problems. Wartime aircraft were pushed harder than ever before. Engines sometimes failed under extreme stress. That was simply the risk of combat aviation. But the reports kept coming. Pilots from different squadrons began describing the exact same experience. They would dive toward an enemy aircraft, the engine would suddenly cut out, and for several long seconds, the fighter became almost powerless. During those seconds, the enemy could escape, or worse, turn the tables. In the deadly chess match of aerial combat, losing power in a dive meant losing the advantage. The strange failures were particularly alarming because Britain's fighters were powered by one of the most advanced aircraft engines in the world, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin engine was the pride of British aviation engineering. It powered both the elegant Supermarine Spitfire and the rugged Hawker Hurricane, the two aircraft that formed the backbone of the RAF's defense. The Merlin was powerful, fast, and reliable. Engineers had spent years perfecting its design. With over 1,000 horsepower and a sleek liquid-cooled system, it allowed British fighters to climb quickly and fight at high altitude. Pilots trusted the engine with their lives. Yet somehow, in the most critical moment of combat, that same engine seemed to betray them. Inside squadron briefing rooms across southern England, pilots began quietly discussing the problem among themselves. Some had experienced it once, others had encountered it several times. Each story sounded eerily similar. The engine failure always happened during a negative G maneuver, when the aircraft suddenly pitched downward into a steep dive. The moment the pilot pushed the nose down, the engine would cough and lose power. Sometimes the failure lasted only 2 seconds, sometimes longer. But in aerial combat, even 2 seconds could be the difference between shooting down an enemy aircraft and becoming one more name on a casualty list. For the pilots facing German fighters in the sky, the problem was more than an inconvenience, it was terrifying. Across the Channel, German pilots seemed to have discovered the weakness long before the British understood it themselves. During dogfights, Luftwaffe pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 often used a simple escape maneuver. When a British fighter got behind them, they would suddenly push their aircraft into a steep dive. Gravity would pull them downward at tremendous speed. British pilots instinctively tried to follow, but the moment they pushed their aircraft into the same dive, their engines would sputter and lose power. Instead of accelerating toward their target, they were forced to level out and wait for the engine to recover. By the time power returned, the enemy fighter was already gone. Again and again, British pilots watched their enemies escape using this same tactic. At first, it seemed like clever flying. German pilots were known for aggressive maneuvers and bold tactics. But as the pattern repeated itself over dozens of engagements, it became clear that something deeper was happening. The Germans weren't just diving to escape. They were exploiting a weakness. In squadron after squadron, RAF fighters returned from combat with the same unsettling realization. Their aircraft, despite being among the best fighters in the world, had a hidden flaw, one that appeared only in the heat of battle. The strange engine cutouts were becoming more frequent as the air war intensified. During the height of the Battle of Britain, hundreds of aircraft filled the skies every day. Pilots fought at altitudes above 20,000 feet, weaving through clouds and contrails while trying to track enemies moving at over 300 miles per hour. In that chaotic environment, every advantage mattered. A fighter that could dive faster could choose when to attack. A fighter that lost power in a dive became vulnerable. Some pilots began adapting their tactics to avoid the dangerous maneuver. Others simply accepted the risk and hoped the engine would recover quickly enough to save them. But the fear remained. More and more RAF reports mentioned the same mysterious failure, always occurring under the same conditions, always during a dive. Ground engineers studied the engines carefully after each mission. They checked fuel lines, carburetors, spark plugs, and cooling systems. They inspected every bolt and pipe. Yet nothing seemed broken. Nothing seemed wrong. And that made the mystery even more disturbing. If the Merlin engine itself wasn't damaged, then why was it failing exactly when pilots needed it most? The question spread quietly across airfields across Britain. Mechanics debated possible causes late into the night. Squadron leaders filed reports up the chain of command. Engineers at aircraft factories examined technical diagrams, searching for clues. Meanwhile, the pilots continued flying. Every mission carried the same uncertainty. When the moment came to dive after an enemy aircraft, no pilot could be completely sure what would happen. Would the engine roar with power, or would it suddenly fall silent? Inside British most advanced fighter aircraft, a hidden flaw was waiting to reveal itself. And until someone understood that flaw, every RAF pilot climbing into the cockpit carried an invisible risk into the skies above the English Channel. The air war over southern England intensified as the summer of 1940 turned into one of the most dangerous periods in British history. Every morning, radar stations along the coast began detecting formations of German aircraft assembling across the English Channel. Within minutes, the warning spread through RAF airfields. Sirens wailed, pilots ran toward their aircraft, and ground crews pulled away the last wheel chocks as engines roared to life. The Battle of Britain had begun in earnest, and every day the skies became a battlefield. RAF pilots climbed rapidly to intercept incoming bombers, escorted by German fighters. The formations collided high above the clouds, where sunlight flashed across spinning propellers, and tracer fire streaked through the air like burning threads. Dogfights erupted across miles of sky as individual pilots chased one another through steep climbs and violent dives.
In these chaotic battles, survival often depended on a pilot's ability to control the fight. Speed, altitude, and positioning could decide everything in a matter of seconds. The pilot who held the advantage could strike. The pilot who lost it often never returned home. Very quickly, German fighter pilots began noticing something unusual about their British opponents. The Luftwaffe's main fighter during the battle was the Messerschmitt Bf-109, a fast and heavily armed aircraft that had already proven itself during earlier campaigns in Europe. German pilots had spent years training in aggressive aerial tactics, and they were quick to test the limits of their enemies. During early engagements with RAF fighters, some German pilots discovered an escape maneuver that worked almost every time. When a British Spitfire or Hurricane managed to get behind them, the German pilot would suddenly push the control stick forward, forcing the aircraft into a steep dive. The nose dropped sharply toward the earth, gravity pulling the fighter downward as its engine screamed with power. British pilots immediately tried to follow, but the moment they pushed their own aircraft into the same maneuver, something strange happened again. The engine sputtered. Fuel flow faltered. For a brief but terrifying moment, the Merlin engine lost power. Instead of accelerating into the dive, the British fighter hesitated in mid-air, its engine coughing violently before recovering seconds later. By the time the aircraft regained full power, the German pilot had already disappeared below. At first, this seemed like coincidence, but Luftwaffe pilots began sharing stories after returning from their missions. Again and again, they described the same strange reaction from British aircraft. Every time they forced their opponents into a sudden dive, the British fighters lost power. Soon, what began as an observation turned into a deliberate tactic. German pilots started using the maneuver intentionally during combat. If a British fighter gained the advantage, the German pilot simply rolled his aircraft forward into a dive. The British pilot following behind would experience the now familiar engine failure. Within seconds, the German fighter could escape. Among Luftwaffe pilots, the mysterious weakness soon earned a nickname. They began calling it the English disease. To the Germans, it seemed like a flaw built directly into British aircraft engines, a strange mechanical sickness that appeared only when the aircraft performed certain maneuvers. German pilots joked about it during briefings, confident that they had discovered a hidden advantage in the skies over Britain. For RAF pilots, however, the situation was far from amusing. Every combat report describing the same engine cutout added to a growing sense of frustration. British fighters were fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. In many situations, they could match German aircraft in performance. But during dives, something went terribly wrong. The problem was particularly dangerous because diving was one of the most important tactics in aerial combat. A fighter pilot often used altitude as stored energy. By diving toward an enemy aircraft, a pilot could rapidly increase speed, turning gravity into acceleration. A successful diving attack allowed a pilot to close distance quickly, fire a burst of machine gun rounds, and then climb away before the enemy could react. Without the ability to dive freely, British fighters were fighting with a serious disadvantage. Many RAF pilots began noticing that German aircraft seemed to dive without hesitation. Messerschmitt fighters could plunge downward almost vertically if necessary, their engines continuing to run smoothly even under intense negative gravity. The British Merlin engine, however, reacted very differently. Whenever the aircraft entered a sudden negative G dive, when gravity briefly pulled the pilot upward against his harness rather than downward into his seat, the engine struggled to maintain fuel flow. Instead of accelerating into the dive, the British fighter hesitated in mid-air, its engine coughing violently before recovering seconds later. By the time the aircraft regained full power, the German pilot had already disappeared below. At first, this seemed like coincidence, but Luftwaffe pilots began sharing stories after returning from their missions. Again and again, they described the same strange reaction from British aircraft. Every time they forced their opponents into a sudden dive, the British fighters lost power. Soon, what began as an observation turned into a deliberate tactic. German pilots started using the maneuver intentionally during combat. If a British fighter gained the advantage, the German pilot simply rolled his aircraft forward into a dive. The British pilot following behind would experience the now familiar engine failure. Within seconds, the German fighter could escape. Among Luftwaffe pilots, the mysterious weakness soon earned a nickname. They began calling it the English disease. To the Germans, it seemed like a flaw built directly into British aircraft engines, a strange mechanical sickness that appeared only when the aircraft performed certain maneuvers. German pilots joked about it during briefings, confident that they had discovered a hidden advantage in the skies over Britain. For RAF pilots, however, the situation was far from amusing. Every combat report describing the same engine cutout added to a growing sense of frustration. British fighters were fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. In many situations, they could match German aircraft in performance. But during dives, something went terribly wrong. The problem was particularly dangerous because diving was one of the most important tactics in aerial combat. A fighter pilot often used altitude as stored energy. By diving toward an enemy aircraft, a pilot could rapidly increase speed, turning gravity into acceleration. A successful diving attack allowed a pilot to close distance quickly, fire a burst of machine gun rounds, and then climb away before the enemy could react. Without the ability to dive freely, British fighters were fighting with a serious disadvantage. Many RAF pilots began noticing that German aircraft seemed to dive without hesitation. Messerschmitt fighters could plunge downward almost vertically if necessary, their engines continuing to run smoothly even under intense negative gravity. The British Merlin engine, however, reacted very differently. Whenever the aircraft entered a sudden negative G dive, when gravity briefly pulled the pilot upward against his harness rather than downward into his seat, the engine struggled to maintain fuel flow. Instead of accelerating into the dive, the British fighter hesitated in midair, its engine coughing violently before recovering seconds later. By the time the aircraft regained full power, the German pilot had already disappeared below. At first, this seemed like coincidence, but Luftwaffe pilots began sharing stories after returning from their missions. Again and again, they described the same strange reaction from British aircraft. Every time they forced their opponents into a sudden dive, the British fighters lost power. Soon, what began as an observation turned into a deliberate tactic. German pilots started using the maneuver intentionally during combat. If a British fighter gained the advantage, the German pilot simply rolled his aircraft forward into a dive. The British pilot following behind would experience the now familiar engine failure. Within seconds, the German fighter could escape. Among Luftwaffe pilots, the mysterious weakness soon earned a nickname. They began calling it the English disease. To the Germans, it seemed like a flaw built directly into British aircraft engines, a strange mechanical sickness that appeared only when the aircraft performed certain maneuvers. German pilots joked about it during briefings, confident that they had discovered a hidden advantage in the skies over Britain. For RAF pilots, however, the situation was far from amusing. Every combat report describing the same engine.
By late 1940, the mysterious engine failures were no longer just scattered complaints from frustrated pilots. The reports had grown too consistent, too detailed and too dangerous to ignore. Across RAF airfields, mechanics and engineers were quietly discussing the same troubling pattern. Every description from the pilots pointed to the same moment in flight, the instant a fighter aircraft pushed into a -G dive. Yet, despite the growing evidence, the official response moved slowly. The British aviation industry was enormous, but it was also deeply bureaucratic. Aircraft design involved layers of engineers, manufacturers, government officials, and military authorities. Every modification to a combat aircraft required testing, approval, documentation, and careful coordination with production lines that were already running day and night to supply the war effort. Changing anything in the Merlin engine was not a simple decision. For many officials inside the Air Ministry, the problem appeared to be an unfortunate limitation of current technology. Carburetor-based fuel systems had been used in aircraft engines for years. Engineers understood their strengths and weaknesses. The Merlin engine itself was still considered one of the finest power plants in the world. From their perspective, the reports from pilots were simply describing a known limitation under extreme conditions. But for the men flying combat missions every day, the situation felt very different. Pilots were risking their lives in the air while knowing that one particular maneuver could suddenly rob their aircraft of power. Some began experimenting with awkward workarounds in the middle of dogfights. Instead of pushing the aircraft directly into a -G dive, they would roll the plane upside down first and then pull into the dive. By doing this, gravity still pushed fuel into the carburetor, allowing the engine to keep running. The maneuver worked, but it was slow, complicated, and dangerous in the chaos of combat. While experienced pilots sometimes managed to perform the trick, younger pilots often could not react quickly enough in the heat of battle. A delay of even a few seconds could mean losing the enemy, or worse. Somewhere within Britain's engineering world, however, one person began looking at the problem differently. Her name was Beatrice Schilling. Unlike many engineers working inside offices far from the front lines, Schilling had always been drawn to machines that moved fast and pushed the limits of technology. She was already known among colleagues as a brilliant and unconventional thinker, someone who approached mechanical problems with both precision and creativity. Born in Britain in the early 20th century, Schilling developed a fascination with engineering at a time when very few women entered the field. From an early age, she showed a natural talent for understanding how machines worked. She studied mechanical engineering and quickly built a reputation for her sharp technical mind. But engineering was not her only passion. Beatrice Schilling also loved speed. Outside of her work, she was a skilled motorcycle racer who regularly competed in events across Britain. She tuned her own engines, modified mechanical components, and pushed machines to their limits on winding roads and racetracks. This hands-on experience gave her a deep understanding of how engines behaved under extreme conditions. By the time the war intensified, Schilling was working as an engineer involved with aircraft engine development. The Merlin engine and its mysterious failures during -G dives soon caught her attention. Unlike many engineers who were focused on large-scale redesigns, Schilling started by examining the basic physics behind the problem. She studied the Merlin's carburetor system carefully. In normal flight, fuel flowed into the carburetor through a float chamber that regulated the mixture of air and fuel entering the engine. The system worked beautifully when gravity behaved normally. But in a -G maneuver, gravity effectively reversed its direction. Instead of pushing fuel toward the carburetor's intake system, the sudden shift caused fuel to flood certain parts of the mechanism while starving others. The carefully balanced mixture entering the engine collapsed, causing the brief power loss pilots experienced. For many engineers, this seemed like an unavoidable limitation of the carburetor design. But Schilling began asking a different question. What if the problem didn't require a complete redesign?
What if the solution was something far simpler? Instead of focusing on the entire fuel system, she concentrated on the specific moment when the fuel surge occurred. If the sudden rush of fuel inside the carburetor could somehow be controlled or restricted, the engine might maintain a stable mixture even during a negative G maneuver. It was a small detail inside a very complex machine, but sometimes small details changed everything. Schilling began sketching possible solutions. Rather than redesigning the carburetor itself, a process that could take months of testing and manufacturing changes, she imagined a simple mechanical insert that could be placed inside the fuel line. The device would regulate how quickly fuel could flow through a specific part of the carburetor. In normal flight, the restriction would have almost no effect. The engine would receive the fuel it needed without any noticeable change in performance. But during a sudden negative G dive, the insert would prevent the uncontrolled surge of fuel that disrupted the mixture. In theory, the engine would continue running smoothly even when the aircraft dove aggressively. The idea was surprisingly simple, so simple in fact that many engineers might have overlooked it entirely. But Schilling understood something important about engineering under wartime conditions. The best solution was not always the most complex one. The best solution was the one that could be implemented immediately. While aircraft factories were already struggling to keep up with production demands, redesigning an entire fuel system would slow everything down. A small mechanical insert, however, could be produced quickly and installed directly on aircraft already in service. Schilling refined the design carefully. The device itself was little more than a precisely measured brass disc with a small hole drilled through its center. By controlling the size of that opening, the device could limit the rate at which fuel moved through the carburetor during sudden changes in gravity. It was a tiny piece of metal, yet if it worked, it could solve the problem that had been haunting RAF pilots for months. There was just one obstacle: convincing the military bureaucracy to approve such a solution. The British Air Ministry operated through strict procedures. Any modification to combat aircraft required formal testing and authorization. Engineers needed approval from multiple departments before implementing changes to frontline machines. And Beatrice Schilling was proposing something unusual. She was suggesting that a simple mechanical insert, something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, could solve a problem affecting thousands of aircraft engines. To some officials, the idea sounded almost too simple, but Schilling believed strongly in her analysis. If the problem was caused by uncontrolled fuel flow during negative G maneuvers, then controlling that flow could eliminate the engine failures entirely. She knew that somewhere above the clouds, RAF pilots were still facing the same terrifying moment in combat, the instant when their engines suddenly lost power in a dive, and she believed she had found a way to stop it. The only question now was whether anyone would allow her to prove it.
By early 1941, the air war over Britain had changed, but the problem inside the Merlin engine still remained. RAF fighters had survived the worst months of the Battle of Britain, yet pilots continued to report the same frightening experience during combat dives. Every time the aircraft entered negative G, the engine could choke and lose power for a few critical seconds. For the men flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, those seconds still felt like a lifetime. Inside engineering offices and test facilities, discussions about the problem continued, but progress was painfully slow. Large technical solutions were being studied, including entirely new fuel injection systems that could replace the carburetors. But those solutions required redesigning major parts of the engine, retooling factories, and interrupting wartime production. Britain could not afford that delay. Aircraft were needed immediately. Squadrons were already flying machines built only days earlier, rushed straight from factories to airfields.
Any solution that required months of redesign might arrive too late to help the pilots already fighting in the sky. That was exactly why Beatrice Schilling believed her idea mattered. Instead of redesigning the engine, she focused on controlling the sudden fuel surge inside the carburetor during -G maneuvers. Her proposed solution was astonishingly simple: a small brass restrictor that limited how quickly fuel could pass through part of the carburetor system. The device was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, but its effect could potentially change the behavior of the entire engine. Schilling worked carefully to determine the exact size of the opening in the restrictor plate. If the hole was too small, the engine might be starved of fuel during normal operation. If it was too large, the device would not prevent the fuel surge that caused the engine cutout. Precision mattered. After calculations and testing, she finalized the design. The result was a small brass disc with a carefully measured opening in its center. Installed inside the carburetor system, it would regulate fuel flow just enough to prevent the dangerous flooding that occurred during -G dives. Now the design needed to be tested on real aircraft. Unlike many engineers who remained inside laboratories, Schilling took a far more direct approach. She was determined not only to prove that the device worked, but to bring the solution directly to the pilots who needed it. Working with a small team, she began preparing kits that could be installed on operational aircraft. Then she did something unusual for an engineer during wartime. She traveled to the RAF bases herself. Airfields across Britain were busy, noisy places. Fighters landed and took off constantly. Ground crews rushed between aircraft, and the smell of aviation fuel filled the air. Mechanics worked long hours maintaining engines that had just returned from combat. Into this environment arrived Beatrice Schilling, carrying boxes of small brass devices. At first, many mechanics and pilots were skeptical. The problem inside the Merlin engine had frustrated engineers for months. It seemed unlikely that something so small could solve such a serious issue. But Schilling was confident. She explained the physics of the problem to the ground crews and showed them exactly where the restrictor needed to be installed inside the carburetor system. The installation itself was surprisingly quick. Skilled mechanics could complete the modification in a short amount of time without removing the entire engine. Within hours, the first modified fighters were ready for testing. Pilots climbed into their cockpits and took off as usual, not entirely sure what to expect. Many of them had experienced the engine failure during dives before. They knew exactly how the Merlin behaved when the problem occurred. Now they would find out whether the small brass device made any difference. During the test flights, pilots pushed their aircraft into steep -G dives, the exact maneuver that had caused the engine cutouts during combat. But this time, something remarkable happened. The engine did not sputter. Instead of choking and losing power, the Merlin continued running smoothly. The aircraft accelerated downward just as a fighter should during a dive. The pilot remained fully in control. For the first time, British fighters could dive aggressively without fear that the engine would suddenly fail. News of the successful test spread quickly across the airfield. Pilots who had struggled with the mysterious engine failure were eager to try the modification themselves. More aircraft were fitted with the brass restrictor. One after another, pilots performed the same maneuver in the air. Each time, the result was the same. The engine kept running. What had once been a dangerous weakness suddenly disappeared. The simple device began spreading rapidly through RAF squadrons. Mechanics installed it on Spitfires and Hurricanes across multiple air bases. Because the modification required only a small mechanical insert, it could be implemented far faster than any major redesign. Within weeks, large numbers of RAF fighters had received the new component. Among the pilots, the device soon gained an unofficial nickname. In typical British humor, they began calling it Miss Schilling's Orifice. The name was both a joke and a tribute to the engineer who had solved a problem that had haunted them for months. For the pilots flying combat missions, the tiny brass restrictor represented something far more important than its size suggested. It gave them confidence. Now, when a German fighter attempted the familiar escape maneuver, pushing into a steep dive, the British pilot could follow immediately. The Merlin engine no longer lost power. The chase could continue. For the Luftwaffe pilots who had grown accustomed to exploiting the weakness, the change was sudden and unexpected. The tactic that once guaranteed escape no longer worked. British fighters were now diving just as aggressively as their German opponents. And all of it had been made possible by a simple piece of brass designed by an engineer who believed the solution did not have to be complicated. Sometimes the most powerful changes in warfare did not come from massive machines or new weapons. Sometimes they came from one small idea, carefully placed inside the heart of an engine.
By mid-1941, something subtle but important had changed in the skies over Europe. RAF pilots climbing into their Spitfires and Hurricanes no longer carried the same quiet fear that had followed them for months. The strange engine failures that once haunted their diving attacks had largely disappeared. The Merlin engines now behaved the way pilots had always expected them to. When a fighter pilot pushed the nose of the aircraft downward into a steep dive, the engine kept running smoothly. The propeller continued spinning at full power, and the aircraft accelerated exactly as it should. For the first time since the early days of the war, British pilots could fully trust their machines in every maneuver. The difference in combat was immediate. Before the modification, German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had relied heavily on their ability to escape by diving suddenly toward the ground. It had been one of their most reliable defensive tactics. When a British fighter appeared behind them, a quick push of the control stick would send the German aircraft plunging downward, confident that the British engine would choke if it tried to follow. But now the situation had changed. When German pilots performed the same maneuver, RAF fighters followed them without hesitation. The Merlin engine continued delivering power even during the -G dive, allowing the British aircraft to accelerate just as quickly as their enemy. The brief window of escape that German pilots once depended on had vanished. Some Luftwaffe pilots were confused the first time it happened. The familiar tactic suddenly failed. British fighters stayed close behind them during dives, maintaining pressure and sometimes closing the distance even further. The hidden weakness that German pilots once joked about as the English disease had quietly been cured. Across RAF squadrons, the small brass restrictor designed by Beatrice Schilling was now installed in large numbers of aircraft. Mechanics could fit the device quickly during routine maintenance, and soon the modification became standard across many frontline fighters. Pilots began noticing another important change as well. Because they could now dive aggressively without fear of engine failure, their tactical options expanded. Diving attacks became far more effective. Pilots could convert altitude into speed without hesitation, giving them greater control during dogfights. In aerial combat, confidence in an aircraft's engine could mean everything. A fighter pilot constantly balanced speed, altitude, and maneuverability while making split-second decisions. If the pilot doubted how the engine would behave in a critical moment, hesitation could appear at exactly the wrong time. The modification removed that doubt. RAF pilots could finally fly their aircraft to the limits of their design. In the months that followed, engineers continued working on more advanced solutions, including the development of fuel injection systems that would eventually replace carburetors entirely.
Those systems would permanently eliminate the negative G fuel problem in later aircraft designs. But during the crucial early years of the war, those technologies were not yet ready. The tiny brass restrictor had filled the gap. It was not a glamorous invention, it did not look impressive, and it did not involve complex machinery or advanced technology. To anyone unfamiliar with aircraft engines, it appeared almost insignificant. Yet that simple device had solved a problem that affected thousands of fighter aircraft during one of the critical periods of the war. And it had done so quickly enough to matter. While engineers continued refining aircraft designs in laboratories and factories, the small modification was already helping pilots survive combat missions over the English Channel and occupied Europe. The story of the device also spread quietly among the pilots who relied on it. The nickname Miss Schilling's orifice remained popular in RAF circles, reflecting the mixture of humor and respect pilots felt toward the engineer who had created it. For Beatrice Schilling herself, the achievement was simply another example of practical engineering. She never set out to become famous. She had approached the problem the same way she approached any mechanical challenge, by understanding the physical forces involved and finding the simplest possible solution. Where others had considered large and complicated redesigns, she focused on the precise moment when the failure occurred. By controlling a single detail inside the carburetor, she prevented the chain reaction that caused the engine to fail. In many ways, it was the kind of solution that only a deeply practical engineer would imagine. Schilling continued working in engineering long after the war, contributing to further advancements in aircraft technology. But her wartime achievement remained one of the most remarkable examples of how a single idea could influence an entire battlefield. Thousands of RAF pilots flew aircraft equipped with the small restrictor she designed. Many of them never met her. Many never knew the full story behind the device installed deep inside their engine. But every time their aircraft dove toward an enemy fighter and the Merlin engine continued roaring without interruption, they were benefiting from her work. History often remembers wars through the stories of generals, famous battles, and powerful weapons. Yet behind every machine used in combat are engineers solving problems that most people never see. Sometimes the survival of a pilot, or even the outcome of a battle, depends on a small mechanical detail hidden inside a complex machine. In the case of the Merlin engine, that detail was a tiny brass disc designed by an engineer who refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. Because of that decision, the skies above Britain became just a little less dangerous for the pilots who defended them. And the deadly flaw once feared in every dive became nothing more than a solved problem, quietly fixed by a woman whose ingenuity changed the course of aerial combat.